This is the story of a 3-month voyage in a wooden rowboat south through the Inside Passage from Skagway, Alaska to Sydney, British Columbia, about 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers. This episode describes the trip through Alaska and will be followed by 2 more episodes for the northern coast of British Columbia in Part 2 and the southern coast of British Columbia in Part 3. Please see the prologue that explains the route through the Inside Passage, the boat and gear, and getting to Bellingham, Washington to catch the ferry to Skagway. From Skagway, I rode south through Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, Frederick Sound, Wrangell Narrows, Sumner Strait, Zimovia Passage, Ernest Sound, Clarence Strait, Revillagigedo Channel, and then across Dixon Entrance to Prince Rupert. The Alaska Marine Highway ferry Kennecott departed from the Bellingham terminal in the late afternoon on Friday, May 10th, and after brief stops in Ketchikan, Wrangell, Petersburg, Juneau, and Haines, arrived in Skagway at the head of Dyea Inlet the following Tuesday afternoon. Dyea Inlet is the most northern part of Chilkoot Inlet in Upper Lynn Canal. Gale force winds were forecasted for later that day and all of the next. The name Skagway is the English derivation of a Tlingit word that refers to the rough seas and strong winds. I would soon discover that these winds are not unique to Skagway and often rage through most of the fjords that penetrate the coast mountains. This is the traditional territory of the Chilkoot Tlingit people. Over 300 years ago, a few Tlingit clans came north and established villages in Upper Lynn Canal. The Chilkoot Tlingit territory extended along the east side of Lynn Canal from present-day Skagway to Berners Bay. Their trade routes over the Chilkoot and White Passes were later used by pioneers following the Alaska Purchase from Russia in 1867, and particularly by prospectors during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898. On May 13th, the ferry dropped me and Waterbird and about 25 other passengers on the dock at Skagway and promptly departed because of the impending storm. The wind was already blowing about 30 knots from the south, and the rain was on the verge of turning into snow. The next morning there was 1 inch of snow on the ground, and it was still blowing hard from the south, so there would be no rowing until the weather calmed down. On May 15th, I loaded the gear in the drizzling pre-dawn hours and departed the harbor at high tide into a headwind of 15 knots, passing several moored cruise ships that towered over Waterbird. My goal that day was to reach the town of Haines. After 6 hours of bashing into the waves, I had only gone 10 miles and was getting tired. The shores of Dyea Inlet are mostly vertical, and there were virtually no safe takeout beaches for resting. I thought about taking a break on a steep boulder shore at the base of a torrential waterfall, but with waves so big, Waterbird would have taken a beating on the rocks, so I kept going. I passed several avalanche chutes with snow that descended to sea level. Around mid-afternoon, the town of Haines finally appeared on the opposite shore, and I crossed Chilkoot Inlet and soon entered the protected harbor behind a massive breakwater, where I laid back in Waterbird, thoroughly exhausted, and reveled in the stillness of the water. Haines is situated on Portage Bay and is the site of a former garrison called Fort Seward that was built in 1903 by the U.S. Army to provide a military presence during the border dispute with Canada. It was early in the tourist season, and I stayed at a waterfront campground with only a few motorhomes and 1 tent occupied by a fisherman looking for work as a deckhand. The next morning, the clouds had blown away, and the surrounding snow-covered ridgelines were silhouetted against a blue sky, a truly spectacular sight. Anywhere else, this would be a national park, but here it's just the typical landscape. I walked to a small coffee shop and had an espresso. In hindsight, that was probably not enough. I debated taking a 0 day, but a gentle north wind and outgoing tide called me back to Waterbird, and with my new friends from the RV park waving goodbye from the dock, I rounded the end of the breakwater and rowed south into the solitude. The sea was blue-gray and ominously calm. A lone humpback whale was heading north, exhaling deeply, and a curious female sea lion surfaced close by to look at Waterbird. The current and wind helped me today, but I could feel yesterday's effort, so I was very glad to see Shikosi Island on the horizon. Shikosi Island is one of a string of islands composed of ancient volcanic rocks extending south in Lynn Canal from the Chilkat Peninsula. In the early afternoon low tide, I found a gravel spit on the south end of the island that offered protection for waterbird, and I set the outhaul running line. At around 6 p.m., the wind increased, so I checked the weather forecast on the marine radio, and the forecast had completely changed. Now the wind was expected to increase overnight to 20 knots from the south, gusting to 30 knots. So with much effort and struggling in surf up to my knees, I hauled Waterbird out onto the beach above the high tide line. In the morning, the wind was blowing as predicted, and the forecast called for more high winds and rain for several days. So I was stuck here for a while, which was upsetting for a couple of black oyster catchers that constantly shrieked at me. On May 21, after 4 days on Shikosi Island, the wind finally calmed, so at 4 a.m. I packed up in the dark and launched, intending to make Point Sherman well before noon. When I had a clear view of Lynn Canal, I saw the lights of 3 huge cruise ships heading north, and decided to not cross to the eastern shore until they had passed. After the last cruise ship cleared the channel, I crossed Lynn Canal and stayed close to the eastern shore, passing an access road to the Kensington gold mine, and arriving at Point Sherman at around 9 a.m. I intended to camp there, but a huge brown bear was feeding on a beached sea lion carcass. The bear ran off when I rounded the point, but the stench of the bloated carcass was overwhelming, so I kept going. A lone wolf appeared from the alders and stared at me, and overhead there were dozens of eagles, all waiting their turn at the carcass. I crossed the mouth of Berners Bay and had a spectacular view of the mountains flanking the Juneau icefield. Shortly after noon, I arrived at Point Bridget State Park on the eastern shore of Favor Channel, where a humpback whale was feeding at the entrance to a small cove. I waited for the whale to leave and then landed Waterbird on a flat gravel beach and made a camp in the tall trees. The next day it was calm, so I decided to go all the way to Auk Bay, just outside of Juneau. After rounding Point Lena, the boat traffic increased and became chaotic with charter fishing boats, whale-watching boats, water taxis, and ferries all merging at the harbor entrance. I hauled Waterbird out on the boat ramp and got a hotel room to dry out, do laundry, and eat. On May 24th, I launched at noon and used the ebbing tide to reach Point Young on Admiralty Island, avoiding Juneau by crossing the northern entrance of Gastineau Channel, which is now practically impassable, mostly because of ground uplift following glacial recession. I then hugged the northern shore of Stevens Passage until reaching Inner Point, and then crossed over to Admiralty Island. The island is home to an estimated population of 1,600 brown bears, which is more than all the brown bears in the lower 48 states. There were many bear tracks on the beach when I arrived, mostly larger than my size 12 boot. I also saw several humpback and orca whales feeding in Stevens Passage. That night, a group of orca whales was hunting next to the beach at Point Young, and I woke to thrashing water, tail slapping, a seal bellowing, and then an unnerving silence. I pitched the tent under a wing fly on a high storm berm, and because of another gale warning, anchored it with all the guy lines, and planned to spend an extra day waiting for the storm to pass. On May 26th, a light drizzle fell on a mostly calm sea, but the winds were forecasted to increase again in the afternoon. I departed Point Young and followed the shoreline of Admiralty Island east, passing Oliver Inlet and the wreck of the SS Islander in Green Cove. At Point Arden, I started feeling the waves increase, and a wind was blowing from the south against the tide ebbing from Taku Inlet, Stevens Passage, and Gastineau Channel. I debated whether it was safe to make for Taku Harbor, but since there were no takeout beaches at Point Arden, I started the crossing of Stevens Passage. About 30 minutes later, I regretted that decision and was fighting a strong headwind, and the wave tops were starting to break. I gave up on making Taku Harbor and changed course for Slocum Inlet, but the wind was too strong, and I had to stop and rest frequently. At the entrance to Slocum Inlet, the winds were howling, and I wasn't making much headway, so changed course again for Suicide Cove, and happily found a sheltered beach to land Waterbird. The beach was small, and at high tide was flooded to the tree line, so I camped in the forest, with the wind roaring through the spruce trees towering overhead. The next afternoon, the winds finally died down. On May 28th, I followed the eastern shore of Stevens Passage south, passing Taku Harbor and Limestone Inlet to Port Snettisham, a fjord deeply indenting the coast mountains. I planned to camp on the north shore of the fjord, but found many bear tracks, so crossed to the south shore and the site of an abandoned mining settlement. It was established as a gold and silver mining camp around 1895, and once had a long wharf extending over the gravel flats, but the village has been uninhabited since 1926, and not much of it remains. It was sunny and warm, so I used the rest of the day to wash, filter water, and do laundry. The next day, I continued to another huge fjord called Holcomb Bay that branches into Endicott Arm to the south, which terminates at Dawes Glacier, and Tracy Arm to the north that ends at the Sawyer Glaciers, all within the Tracy Arm Ford's Terror Wilderness. Ford's Terror is a fjord on the north shore of Endicott Arm, so named for a violent tidal rapid. I camped on Harbor Island, near the base of the Sum Dum Glacier, and the site of a historical fox farm, and opposite a sand spit where an ancient Tlingit village was located until the late 1800s. These fjords are popular with cruise ships that venture to the base of the tidewater glaciers that often calve icebergs directly into the sea. On May 30, with another weather front moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, I used the remaining calm weather to reach Windham Bay. However, I was forced to leave behind the anchor, which got stuck in boulders at the bottom of Holcomb Bay. So now I needed to make do without an anchor, which presented a serious problem. At Windham Bay, I managed to haul Waterbird out on the beach, well above the high tide line. There were at least 4 humpback whales feeding in Windham Bay, staying close together and going back and forth across the bay, making repeated passes by my camp. were also several bears in the area, which made me always be alert. I ended up spending another day here waiting on the weather to improve.
Small craft advisory Sunday. Tonight, south wind 15 knots. Sea is 3 feet. Sunday, southeast wind 15 knots increasing to 25 knots. Gusts to 40 knots.
On June 1st, the wind was still blowing from the south, but I decided to try for the next sheltered place on this exposed coast called Hobart Bay. While I was struggling to dodge rocks and reefs and control waterbird in the waves and currents near islands called the Twins, I saw 2 large fishing boats emerge from the fog, closing on my starboard bow and not changing course. I was so focused on them that I didn't see 4 Kassan Haida canoes bearing down on me from the port side, with at least 10 people in each, paddling hard downwind. So I was startled when people in the first canoe called out to me with a loud cheer. It was so nice to hear other humans, the first in over a week, especially in such an inhospitable place. But we only had a few minutes for a short exchange, and then they were gone. I nearly wept. I camped on Entrance Island, the site of an old lumber camp that was now uninhabited, although the remaining building seemed to be used to support fisheries research. The next day, I rowed across Port Houghton, passing Five Fingers Islands and the Brothers in the distance to reach Cape Fanshawe. In the Roberts Islands, on the southern shore of Port Houghton, a huge motor yacht with 4 decks appeared out of the mist and came close. I craned my neck to look up and talk to the owner, who was very curious about waterbird and our journey. Many bear tracks at Cape Fanshawe made me continue on to Frederick Sound and camp at Point Highland. There was no beach at high tide, so I pitched the tent in the tall trees, ever watchful for bears and more than a little worried about waterbird, now hanging from a makeshift anchor that I made from a heavy steel weight found on the beach at Entrance Island. The following day, I crossed Frederick Sound, dodging the boat traffic coming out of Petersburg and Wrangell Narrows, and entered Portage Bay on Kupreanof Island, where I would wait out another gale for 3 days at a beautiful camp on Low Point.
The storm, with the remains of a tropical system, is expected to increase marine winds to southeast gale force to 35 knots Monday night for the southern inner channels, especially Clarence Strait. Winds are then expected to diminish to 25 knots Tuesday morning before a second wave brings winds back to gale force Tuesday afternoon. Winds will then diminish Wednesday to around 20 knots. Seas are also expected to be elevated.
On June 6th, I arrived in Petersburg in the pouring rain and heavy fishing boat traffic. I got a warm welcome from the harbor master, who showed me where to buy a new anchor and a safe place to haul out and store waterbird. Then I went to a hotel. The foul weather over the last few weeks seems to have everyone on edge, since it was the start of the salmon fishing season. There was a persistent trough of low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska that was causing weather fronts to move over the Southeast Alaska Islands and mainland, creating misery for everyone. At this point, I had to make the difficult decision to give up going to the west side of Prince of Wales Island and stay away from the channels funneling southerly winds through the archipelago and instead favor the more protected passages farther east. On June 8th, I launched Waterbird and departed Petersburg, heading south through Wrangell Narrows. The notorious passage floods from the north, and the harbor master helpfully advised me to leave at least 2 hours before the slack in order to row with the current to the Narrows between Greenpoint and Blind Point, where the current reverses and floods from the south. The Narrows are famous for strong currents, upwelling boils, and rock reefs that constrict the channel, so timing the tides is critical for a safe passage in a small human-powered boat. Luckily, I am an oceanographer and know something about tides and currents. However, the transit through the Narrows didn't quite work out as planned. I managed to make it to Blind Point and was ready to let the ebb current do all the work, but instead slammed into a 20-knot headwind coming out of Sumner Strait that forced me to take emergency shelter. I strung a hammock in the trees and waited for the wind to die down, which didn't happen until 2 a.m., and then waited another 2 hours for the tide to ebb again. But the rest of the passage through the Narrows was magical in the early morning twilight. Crossing Sumner Strait was tricky because of the tide rips that developed at the mouth of the Stikine River, especially during the highest tides of the month. But I made it to Vank Island before the afternoon winds arrived, which was a huge relief. The beach had very little room for a tent at high tide, and that night I heard the waves gradually encroaching, racking my nerves until about 2 a.m. when the tide turned and the water receded. It was calm at daybreak, and I used those conditions to cross the remaining Stikine River currents to the west coast of Wrangell Island. I decided to not stop at the town of Wrangell, but camped 15 miles south of town at an unnamed point of land after a difficult and dangerous crossing of Zimovia Channel. Here I met Rowboat Bob, clearly a local hermit, who lived in a tent somewhere in the nearby forest and had been there for 20 years. He is apparently a well-known character, named for his dream of someday rowing a boat to Skagway, so we had lots to talk about, but he was straining under the weight of a huge backpack, so I didn't keep him talking long. The next day, on my way south through Zimovia Passage, 2 crusty-looking fishermen in a metal skiff came bearing down on Waterbird and pulled up short to have a chat. They heard about Waterbird from Rowboat Bob and were very curious about our trip. They offered me a place to camp that night, and before leaving, tossed over a bag with a fresh round loaf of sourdough bread, courtesy of Rowboat Bob. The kindness of strangers is sometimes overwhelming. I camped that night in the pouring rain near an off-the-grid community called Tom's Place at the south end of Zimovia Passage near Ernest Sound. It was still raining the next morning, but not windy, so rowing west through Ernest Sound was delightful. I planned to camp at Emerald Bay, but on arrival could not find the perfect combination of a safe place for Waterbird and a place to camp, so continued along the Cleveland Peninsula to a tombolo on a small island near Vixen Point. It was a long day, but would make the next day much shorter to the settlement of Myerschuck on Clarence Strait. Myerschuck is an off-the-grid community situated along the shoreline of a natural harbor that provides a sheltered anchorage for small boats, and was historically used and settled by salmon trollers that came here seeking shelter during storms in Clarence Strait. Today, the community consists mostly of seasonal residents, and I was allowed to camp on the lawn of a beautiful waterfront cabin. Waterbird was safely at anchor, and I slept very well that night. I dreaded venturing into Clarence Strait, which is wide open to the Pacific, but the sea dragons were relatively quiet that day and let me pass. I reached Kamano Point in the early afternoon, and after some searching found a beautiful secluded beach amongst a mostly vertical rocky shoreline and camped on Bame Canal, with the town of Ketchikan in the distance. When deer seem to look at me this way, I must look over my shoulder in case they aren't looking at me at all, but the bear is sneaking up behind me. On June 15th, 1 month after leaving Skagway, I arrived at Knutson Cove outside of Ketchikan for my first major resupply. The package of food I sent was delivered to the marina at Knutson Cove so I could avoid the cruise ship chaos in Ketchikan. One of the staff at the marina was out fishing for salmon that day and took pictures of Waterbird crossing Bame Canal. I parked Waterbird under a cover and took a taxi to a hotel for a much-needed shower, rest, and food. I left Knutson Cove on June 17th and rounded Point Higgins to enter Tongass Narrows, a water passage separating Revilla-Gagedo Island from Gravina Island. There was a lot of boat traffic coming from the 4 cruise ships in town all the way to Mountain Point at the south end of the Narrows. I then got caught in a tide rip crossing George Inlet and was nearly exhausted reaching Icehouse Cove, where there were supposed to be camping options. But the shores were all nearly vertical, so I continued and found another inlet a few miles farther east at the base of Black Mountain and landed Waterbird on a beach at the head of the cove and pitched my tent near several cabins and a fishing lodge. It was a long day with a good ending. I started to dislike the inlet crossings, which seemed to always engulf me in tide rips, which could easily be avoided by waiting for slack tide, but then the trip would take weeks longer. After Black Mountain, I wanted to row to the Slate Islands, but the crossing of Bame Canal beat me up badly, so I stopped for the day on a beautiful beach between Bame Canal and Boca de Quadra, and it was here that I first felt the long wavelength swells of the Pacific. The beach was very rough at low tide, and Waterbird went dry on some large rocks, fortunately with no damage. On June 19th, I set out for Breakwater Cove in Dixon Entrance. The cove is well known to the many gillnetters fishing the coast for salmon and who use the relatively sheltered harbor to transfer their catch to tenders. At Foggy Bay, I heard someone calling to me and looked over my right shoulder to see a kayaker paddling hard towards Waterbird. This was Andrew, and we chatted for about a half an hour while the sea swells rolled underneath us. The seas in Dixon Entrance were very lumpy because the ocean swell was reflected off the rocky shoreline, creating standing waves, and I was thankful to find a sandy beach in Breakwater Cove, protected by a large rock for a safe landing. But Dixon Entrance was not done with me yet. The sound of huge waves breaking on the beach woke me up at 2 in the morning, and I had a bad feeling that Waterbird was in trouble. I looked out the tent door and saw no trace of the boat or running line, only the moon reflecting off the rolling seas. Waterbird was gone. This was my worst nightmare. I scrambled out of the tent and peered into the twilight and finally saw Waterbird perched on a rock about 300 feet from shore, hanging on a ledge at a 30-degree angle and held only by the fouled anchor line. My only option was to swim out and retrieve Waterbird. It was very scary, but I had no other choice. The water was breathtakingly cold, but I was so focused on the task that I didn't realize the hypothermia until afterwards, when the uncontrollable shivering started. I was certain Waterbird was holed, but incredibly I could find no damage. I lowered Waterbird from the ledge using the bow painter, and then swam back to the beach, towing everything, and then reset the anchors. Afterwards, I had 2 cups of hot coffee and crawled into the sleeping bag to warm up. With the sunrise, all was back to normal, the seas had calmed, and it all seemed like a bad dream. I launched Waterbird early, rode past the Tree Point Lighthouse, and rounded Cape Fox to enter Nakat Bay, where the winds picked up again, but this time on the stern. Waterbird practically surfed into the bay, passing Tongass Island in a hissing sea, and with the sea spray flying, entered Sitclan Passage that connects to Tongass Passage that eventually crosses the international border with Canada into British Columbia. An amazing white sand beach appeared in the Proctor Islands that seemed almost tropical and gave us a safe landing and a place to camp that night. The next morning, I had to cross Portland Inlet, another notoriously difficult fjord that is essentially a river, but this time I could time the crossing for the morning low slack tide before the sea breeze picks up. A tide rip still appeared around halfway through the crossing, but I managed to outpace its advance and reached the eastern shore just north of Port Simpson and the village of Loch Qualams by mid-morning. I landed Waterbird on a small island south of Burnt Cliff Island and stayed there for an extra day waiting on weather.
Forecast for Dixon Entrance East and Hecate Strait, northern half issued by Environment Canada at 4 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, Friday, June 21st, 2024. Tonight and Saturday, gale warning in effect. Wind southeast 25 to 35 knots, becoming southeast 20 to 30 late overnight and diminishing to southeast 15 to 20 Saturday.
This storm delivered a huge amount of seaweed to the beach and the small cove where Waterbird was anchored. It took about an hour to cut free of the mess. On June 23rd, I planned to reach Prince Rupert to check in with customs and set out early in the rain that fell from the remains of the gale. I rode through beautiful Ven Passage, passing the village of Old Metlakatla, then across Prince Rupert Harbor to Cow Bay, and finally rounded the breakwater of the Prince Rupert Rowing and Yacht Club in the early afternoon. I called customs, who asked me a few questions about the trip and the boat, then walked to a hostel where I met Patty and Rick, who were paddling a tandem kayak from Bellingham to Skagway and had arrived the day before. We had dinner and an excellent evening together, exchanging stories of this trip and many previous ones. That completes part 1, describing the first leg of Waterbird's Inside Passage, of 525 miles or 840 kilometers from Skagway to Prince Rupert. More episodes are coming with Part 2 describing the rounding of Cape Caution and navigating through the myriad islands and intricate passages of the Great Bear Rainforest along the northern coast of British Columbia between Prince Rupert and Port McNeill. Part 3 will be the final episode describing the trip from Port McNeill to Sydney, British Columbia. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe or check back on this channel for the next episodes.